Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. I am Jeremy Nettles, the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ in Newburgh, Indiana. Today is the final installment on John's Gospel. We've been steadily marching through this book over the course of more than a year, during which time the recording studio has changed a few times. I got laser vision, I made just about every videography mistake imaginable, and also discovered that no matter how convenient it was, I really hated the way I looked with short hair. It hasn't made for the most continuous viewing experience, I'm sure, but if you've been with me this whole time, or gone to YouTube to find the playlist on our channel and do an accelerated version, I thank you. You've stuck it out and put up with my primitive, if improving, production abilities, and I hope it has been worthwhile for you. We're going to talk about a lot of the details within it over the course of the next 27 minutes or so, but if you're worried I'm going to ruin the ending, I'd offer the suggestion that you're confused about how to read the Bible. If you have been following along or just fancy yourself a biblical scholar, what would you say if I asked you to summarize the story in John's Gospel in one sentence? Go ahead. I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. Got it? Okay. What's your summary? No, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. The correct answer is I wouldn't summarize the story in John's Gospel because John isn't trying to just tell a story in this book. That had been covered already. See Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is different. So what's John doing if not telling a story? Well, he is telling a story, but his real concern is much bigger. Well, it starts with his purpose statement in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples which are not written in this book, but these are written, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name. That's the whole goal. So that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name. All of the details, all of the facts, all of the stories along the way may help, but the goal isn't to tell a story. The goal is to build faith. Okay, well, how does he do that then? First of all, there's a symmetrical structure to this book. The first third or so of chapter 1 is a prologue, and then chapter 21 is an epilogue. In between, the rest of chapter 1 through chapter 12 covers a bunch of interactions between Jesus and others. These people range from beggars to rulers, from Jewish priests to Gentiles, from fishermen to politicians, from the arrogant and self-righteous to the humble and penitent. The message he shares with them is the same for all. He tells them that he came from God and that he is the way to eternal life. Now that's a pretty bold claim to make, and if you met someone on the street today who told you that he came from God and was the way to eternal life, you'd be perfectly justified in avoiding that person and completely discrediting what they said. But Jesus doesn't just talk, he does. He shows that he's got some supernatural power over and over. Many times it's just displays of knowledge that he couldn't possibly have through natural means, or that would strain the limits of natural explanation at least. But he also does things that are unbelievable. If someone claimed to have done them, you'd say, "No, I don't believe you. You're lying. That's impossible." But John is claiming that they did happen, that he witnessed them happening. And that's his pitch. We'll come back to this in a few minutes, but testimony is one of the important themes of this book. So, after spending those 12 chapters on a bunch of signs Jesus performed to demonstrate that his message wasn't just the product of some aberrant mind, but had God's approval, he then moves on and narrates the events of the Last Supper and Jesus' trial, execution, and resurrection. This covers chapters 13 through 20, but of those 8, 5.5 take place over the course of just a few hours on the night when Jesus was arrested. And then his trial and execution almost feel rushed in comparison. It's almost like John was trying to make a point with that, but I can't imagine what it would be. That long conversation in the upper room and on the road out of the city is surely just one of many evenings Jesus and his disciples shared, asking questions and listening to Jesus' answers, many of which they only partially comprehend. But we're not given any details from the others. It might even strain your willingness to believe that this old man, John, is able to recall with any accuracy what Jesus had said during that one conversation among many 40 to 70 years later. Well, first of all, the way speech was reported in the ancient world was different from our expectations in a world of microphones and video cameras. And people without those luxuries also developed much better memories than we do today, because we can so easily keep records and save ourselves the trouble. But on top of that, among the things Jesus is promising to his disciples that very night is the gift of the Holy Spirit. And John is claiming to have that gift as he writes all of this out. And if God is involved, then all bets are off, and that goes for the whole book. So, it's organized into these two parts. The 3 years or so of tramping around between Galilee and Jerusalem preaching about the kingdom of heaven in part 1, and the few days surrounding Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection in part 2. But there's more to John's organization than prologue, part 1, part 2, epilogue. In addition to the typical narrative structure of rising tension and resolution, he's got some other tricks up his sleeve. Many of these are visible in sub-themes that he weaves through the narrative. It's not always clear why he chose these particular themes, but in general, a comparison to 1 John and the history of the early church after the close of the first century makes it fairly obvious that most of them, at least, are there because, whether through earthly wisdom or help directly from God, John saw what was coming. And he worked hard to handle the heresies, false teachings, and pollution of the gospel that were just beginning by the time John wrote. Let's start with some of the more obvious of these. When he wrote 1 John, he used the word know and its forms about 40 times, which is just astonishing in such a short work as 1 John. This is because Gnostic thought was taking root and growing, and John sees from the start that it stands in conflict with the message of Christ. For those who don't know, the term Gnostic is built on the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. John doesn't exclusively use terms related to gnosis in that letter. He uses synonyms too, because it would just get too repetitive otherwise. But you can see he's hammering on that thought, that idea of knowledge, because of the new fad. The fundamental idea in Gnosticism is that there are some elite few who have a special hidden knowledge, a full enlightenment. Their special spiritual God-given knowledge is supposed to confer status and righteousness and be unattainable for those wretched masses who have not been so chosen, who are still in the dark, so to speak. You can actually see the same fad growing stronger today in our society, almost 2,000 years later, except now it's called being woke. It's exactly the same idea. Most people are, to follow the metaphor, sleeping, and thus unaware of the truth of what's going on around them. And becoming aware entails waking up and seeing the truth, hence the term. Just like the woke today, the Gnostics of John's time and later made up some really stupid... Let's approach that thought in a slightly different way. The new knowledge is unquestionable because it comes from God. It's not up for debate or discussion because only those already initiated into the cult are able to comprehend it. And it's not a conclusion from a set of premises logically interacting with each other, but a first principle, a prior assumption. Adherents can even say completely opposite things that contradict each other, or even things they themselves said a minute ago, without losing their enlightened status. Because truth means nothing, and really it's all about power. The chosen few present themselves as adhering perfectly to a standard of righteousness, but in reality, they have a lot of skeletons in their closets. And finally, their woke, enlightened understanding of the world leads to a co-opting of Christ, while outright denying many of the things he said or instructed his representatives to say on his behalf. One of the principles generally, although not universally, held by the early Gnostics is that all flesh is inherently sinful and irredeemable. You can see how this would be a slight problem for someone professing to be a Christian. What's the solution? Either the man Jesus wasn't really God, or Jesus the Son of God wasn't really a man. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. He's not leaving a whole lot of room for argument there. He's even restating it a few times just to make sure it's crystal clear. In chapter 5, verse 18, this is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Chapter 10, verse 30. I and the Father are one. I can't think of anything to say about that. Chapter 20, verse 28. Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus doesn't rebuke him for saying that. He takes it as given. There are more of these, but these are some of the most obvious examples. He's working very hard to make sure it's clear. Jesus is God. And if you took him seriously already and believed he was the Messiah or Savior or whatever, and are confronted with people who say they are Christians, but seem to be awfully sure of themselves when they say Jesus wasn't really God, well, John wants to make sure you know to outright reject that teaching. Also, he wants it to be clear that Jesus is flesh. Chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Chapter 2, verses 19 through 21. Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. It sounds like a physical, fleshly thing. Chapter 6, verses 51 through 56. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. The Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" So Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him." Now, of course, he doesn't mean this literally. He does mean it in a sort of spiritual sense. But the reason that it has a spiritual importance because his flesh and blood were actual flesh and blood. He is saying in as clear terms as possible, I am flesh and blood. Chapter 19, verse 34. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. Actual blood flowed from this actual man's side when he was stabbed. There are more passages like this, but these do a good job of making the point. Based on what we find in 1 John, this seems to have been the more common takeaway from the Gnostic garbage. For example, he says in 1 John chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, "By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming and now is in the world already." He says more or less the same thing in 2 John 7, by the way. So he goes out of his way to include some of his own personal testimony to Jesus' humanity, as well as Jesus' own preaching that he was flesh and blood. Another theme, at least tangentially related to the whole Gnostic silliness, is the idea of testimony. In chapter 1, let's read verses 6 through 8. By the way, testify is equivalent to bear witness, both for these verses and for all the ones that follow. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. Verse 15. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me." Verse 19. And this is the testimony of John, when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" Verse 32. And John bore witness, "I saw the Spirit descend from heaven like a dove, and it remained on him." Verse 34. And I have seen and have borne witness that this is the Son of God. We're still in chapter 1. We'll have to skip a bunch of the rest. Let's go to chapter 4 and read verse 39. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. So it's not that John is the only one who testifies. There's this Samaritan woman who also testifies about Jesus and the works that he does. Chapter 10, verses 25 and 26. Jesus answered them, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name bear witness about me, but you do not believe because you are not among my sheep." Once again, there he's pointing to the miracles and saying they are a testimony to who he is. Chapter 19, verse 35. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. Now this time it's John describing himself as an eyewitness, giving testimony to, well, something pretty odd, which perhaps we'll discuss in more detail another time because it's fascinating and meaningful. Chapter 21, verse 24. This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. Okay, I hope that's enough to demonstrate to you that John thinks this is kind of an important theme. He brings it up in 1 John 2, by the way, multiple times. It's a big deal, especially as the apostolic period of the early church is winding down, and he's the only apostle remaining alive. Suddenly, the spiritual gifts of tongues and prophecy and healing and what have you are in short supply, with few to none remaining to confer those gifts on others. It was relatively easy to take notice and believe what Peter preached, because Peter healed the sick. Paul's message got some extra attention because a venomous snake bit him without causing any harm. What about when Quintus from the marketplace tells you that some guy rose from the dead and now wants to run your life, and he's super certain it really happened because he once had a sick uncle get better unexpectedly? John's point through all of these references and more has been that the great miracles were just one form of testimony. And now we rely on another type of testimony, which he's determined to commit to paper, parchment, for anyone and everyone to consider on its merits. Another theme is trust. It's not trust in our own works or ourselves or our arbitrary selection for enlightenment, but it's trust in Jesus. Chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Chapter 3, verses 14 through 16. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. There are a lot more of these. Another theme in John's Gospel is the Trinity. Sort of. That word never appears, and John doesn't exactly give a detailed description. In fact, neither of those exists in the entire Bible. But it's clear that, as with everything else, John saw the roots of the argument that was soon to spring up and take the better part of a millennium to settle, still smoldering in some circles. These are concentrated toward the end of the book. Let's go to chapter 14 and read verses 16 and 17. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. You've got the Father, and Jesus is saying, I'm going to ask the Father, and he will send the Spirit. All three of them are together working in concert. In verse 26 of the same chapter, but the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you. Same deal there. In chapter 15, let's read verse 26. But when the Helper comes, whom I will send you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who proceeds from the Father, he will bear witness about me. Once again, they're all three working together as if they are more or less equivalent. John's not unique in referring to Father, Son, and Holy Spirit all together like this, but while I haven't cataloged every such passage, it seems to me that John emphasizes it quietly more often than the other New Testament authors. It's not that he's trying to settle the dispute. It's not even really a dispute yet. It's more like the progression of the theological thought is starting to reach the point at which Christians will begin asking more and more fervently how these three persons or expressions or manifestations of God, or whatever you want to call them, are related. And while John doesn't just lay out the answer, he's careful to bury the tools to finding the answer in his gospel, showing that Jesus already told us what we need to know. I should also note there's an even clearer discussion of this in 1 John 5, at least in some versions of the Bible. It gets interesting and complicated, and we'll talk about it more in detail another time. But that discussion will also dovetail nicely, believe it or not, with another theme in John's Gospel, the place of water in God's power and salvation. This is less in your face than the other themes, but in chapter 1, John is baptizing in the water of the Jordan River. In chapter 2, Jesus turns water into wine. In chapter 3, Jesus tells Nicodemus to be born of water and spirit. In chapter 4, Jesus discusses living water with a Samaritan woman beside a well. In chapter 5, Jesus finds a man looking for healing in the waters of a quasi-magic pool and heals him with a word instead. In chapter 6, Jesus walks on water. In chapter 7, Jesus declares that rivers of living water flow from his heart. In chapter 9, Jesus gives a blind man his sight with the aid of water from his own body, his saliva, and the waters of another pool in Jerusalem already used for ritual purposes. In chapter 13, Jesus washes his disciples' feet and discusses a spiritual washing at the same time. In chapter 19, it's not just blood, but also water that flows from Jesus' pierced side on the cross. Okay, water is fundamental and essential to life itself, so it's no surprise that it's mentioned from time to time. But it comes up a lot more often in John's Gospel than in the others, and in the context of Jesus' teaching and miracles, rather than the incidental need for hydration. I feel like I'm saying this a lot today, but we'll discuss the reasons for this another time. For now, I don't want to get bogged down in it, but boy, let me tell you, it's important. We could get into other themes like double meanings, one physical and one spiritual, that Jesus includes usually on purpose in his teaching. There are extreme contrasts, light and darkness, life and death, eternal and temporary, belief and persecution, love and hate. There are sets of three denials, 3 statements on the cross, 3 days buried, 3 post-resurrection appearances, 3 professions of love. And there are more, too. It's clear that John put a lot of thought and care into the composition of this book. It's not just a court deposition to make sure all the evidence is itemized. It's meticulously constructed for the purpose of generating belief in Christ among its readers. So, what do we get out of this book now that it's all said and done? This book is really deep, and if it doesn't hold your attention, it's because you're not thinking about it hard enough. John is ridiculously wise, and he says what he says always for a reason, although we might not always be able to tell exactly what that reason is. Also, It's a great demonstration that we shouldn't be fooled by whatever newfangled ideas come around. It's happened before, and it will happen again. But God doesn't change, and is always proved right in the end. On top of that, this book shows us that there is ample evidence to back up the radical claims Jesus made. All of the direct evidence is secondhand through the mouths of witnesses, but that testimony is important, and there's a mountain of circumstantial evidence as well. And finally, the fate of your eternal soul rests on your decision whether to believe Jesus is who he says he is. That's not the end of the road, and you don't get to hedge your bet by saying, yeah, I believe, and then living however it is you want to live. If he's the king of the universe, like he says, then he has plenty of authority to boss you around. And if you're not willing to obey him, knowing what's at stake, then it's pretty clear you don't really believe it. You're just lying to the world, to yourself, and to God. What does he command? Well, that's a long list, but let's wrap up in possibly the most iconic passage of John's Gospel in chapter 3. Jesus answered him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." Nicodemus said to him, "How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born?" Jesus answered, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born again. The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear its sound, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who is born of the Spirit." He commands that you become a new person, one who's not just alive in the flesh, but in the Spirit. One that's affected and moved, not just by the things of this world, but by the things of the spiritual realm, which tell you to do things absolutely contrary to logic, that it's better to be selfless, that it's better to admit to imperfection, that it's better to submit your will and your actions to someone higher than you, that this world isn't the sum of your being, but something awaits you when this life is over, and you should prepare for that life while you're living this one. If you need to do any or all of those things, we at River Ridge would be happy to help. We're not the lawgivers or the gatekeepers, that's Jesus. But we are committed to teaching and encouraging what Jesus himself taught and encouraged, and glorifying him in our worship and in our lives. If you'd like to join us, you can find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh, or get in touch with us at 812-550-6234 or info@riverridgechurch.org. I hope to hear from you, and I hope to see you at church. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.